We love Classical Conversations.
Your organization is known worldwide, and we certainly appreciate every facet that you do.
I do believe in what you're doing because I've seen it in my family.
I'm so excited about all the things that, Robert, you guys do with Classical Conversations. It's been a huge blessing for our family.
Grateful for the work at Classical Conversations. You're a leader, and you have been in this movement for a long time.
I do feel like I have a debt of gratitude to you, your family, all of CC for just the fruit that has come from CC.
Appreciate all that you guys do, both through this wonderful podcast and also through Classical Conversations, which I am convinced is the best education resource out there. Thank you very much for all that you do for the cause of Christ and for our families and for our children. Really, really appreciate it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Refining Rhetoric. And today I'm excited to have a Classical Conversations dad with me, Jeff Miller. Dr. Miller, he holds multiple degrees in physical sciences, including a master's degree from the University of Texas at Arlington and a PhD in biomechanical engineering from Auburn University with emphasis in thermodynamics, biothermal science, biotransport phenomena, and navigating and control of biological systems. This is the reason why I did industrial engineering, because one class of thermodynamics was almost enough to get me to quit. So Dr. Miller, he is a published researcher. He has worked at Auburn University, instructed courses in thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and heat transfer, as well as statics and dynamics. I'm also very familiar with statics and dynamics, taking those two classes a combined 5 times as an undergrad before getting through it. He has participated in several creation geological expeditions with leading creation geologists studying seismonites, dinosaur fossil beds, the Grand Canyon, and is currently studying hypo-gene speleogenesis. I should have asked you about all of these things. You can correct me after the intro. All this to say is Jeff is super smart. His wife is a Foundations and Essentials director. He has 5 children. He is the editor of Christian Evidence Journal, Reason and Revelation. He's the editor of the AP's Bible class curriculum, and he's authored several books, including Science versus Evolution and Flooded, and clearly much more intelligent than I am. So, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I put a lot of that stuff in my bio. I just make up all the words and I throw them in there just to watch people trip all over themselves.
Yeah, what is hypo-gene speleogenesis?
Speleogenesis. So basically, it's studying how caves form.
Okay, nice.
Yeah.
So we get millions and millions of years ago, rock hurtled into the earth and created them. Is that right? Is that accurate?
The conventional thinking is that, caves take a long time to form by a weak acid trickling down from above. So rainwater picks up carbon dioxide as it hits the ground and trickles down through the ground, picks up more carbon dioxide from decaying plants and material, turns into soda fizz, carbonic acid. And it's so weak, it takes forever to dissolve a cave. And what biblical creationists have argued for probably decades is, you can also form a cave from more strong acids if they're rising instead of descending, using like sulfuric acid during the flood. And so what I've been doing is studying caves all over the eastern U.S. at this point and showing that they have these features that support what biblical creationists have been arguing in theory for a long time, but we just really didn't have a lot of the actual evidence that substantiates the creationists' predictions about that.
Yeah, so I'm guessing USAID did not fund any of your research. That it's all backed on. No.
Yeah, but what we're finding is that caves can form very rapidly, and the caves that I've looked at all support what creationists have said. It all caves fit the biblical timeline. We can form them rapidly during the flood, and these don't take thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years for these to form. So pretty cool research.
Creation research has been fascinating to me. So how did you get into it? Were you like a lover of dinosaurs, or, tell us the story of how you decided to go down this career path?
In creation science, well, so once I was finishing up my work at Auburn University, Apologetics Press was in need of a full-time scientist to do apologetics, which what apologetics is comes from the Greek word apologia, which is the idea of giving a defense for our faith. We find it there in 1 Peter 3:15, always be ready to give a defense. And so that's what apologetics is. So we're in the business of looking at attacks being made on biblical Christianity, anything from attacking the account in Genesis 1 through 11 in particular, so creation, evolution, the flood. That's more usually the science side of things, but then also issues like, can we know the Bible's really inspired? Is it reliable? Does it have contradictions? Those sorts of things. The deity of Christ as the Bible teaches it, culture war issues that have come from our society being so irreligious for so long. But my side of things is the science side of things. So I'm dealing with attacks that are being made on the Bible from a scientific perspective. So usually it's the evolution side of things, and that's really what I was originally hired on to do at Apologetics Press is responding to challenges being given to biblical creation from an evolutionary side of things. My job has changed over the years, or at least had more added to it over the years, because about 11 years ago now, Bill Nye, the pseudoscience guy, as I like to call him, he squared off against Ken Ham, who's a biblical creationist up at Answers in Genesis, in a debate. And instead of this being a debate about evolution, it was about creation and the flood in particular. And he really opened up what I would consider to be the floodgates on another area of apologetics, and that is not just dealing with the evolutionary idea that is contrary to the Bible, but also being able to defend what the Bible says happened with regard to like the biblical flood. And he brought up a lot of very specific scientific challenges, and that led me to write a response to that, and then to really start digging into this area of apologetics, and that is making our case scientifically better and being able to defend it. And that is what opened up this, what we call the Creation Research Program at Apologetics Press, which is what I'm now the director of and heavily involved in my research and studies.
Now, I don't know the exact number, but I think I've heard the number like 200 to 300 different cultures have a worldwide or localized flood in their lore. And of course, we have the flood in the Bible. Why is it important to prove this scientifically, or can it be proven scientifically at all, or is it just always going to be these are the facts on our side versus the facts on their side? How does that debate get answered?
Yeah, that's a big, that's a massive question. So, science, we don't really say science proves anything. What we do is we put forth theories and models, and we try to gain evidence that supports our model. It's a lot easier to invalidate our theories than it is to validate them. Because if we have a model, a theory, and we say, well, if we're right, then we should find this when we do this experiment or we go do this research. And if we don't find that, we have invalidated our theory. So that's a lot easier to do. But if we find the evidence that supports what we believe, it doesn't necessarily prove that, because the same evidence could actually be used in support of other theories. So what I'm doing in science is showing we've got valid explanations of the data that fits with what the Bible teaches. The Bible, we can know, is sure. It's the only thing we can know that is sure, because it actually has divine attributes. It has characteristics about it that are beyond human or supernatural. So we can know that the Bible is true, and the Bible says the flood happened, and therefore it becomes an apologetics issue now because I've got to defend that the Bible did happen. I got to look at the challenges people are making and say, how do we explain, so many species being on the ark, or Noah being able to build this massive vessel? How could there even be a vessel that large that's wooden? How could that withstand all the pressures of what he had to go through on the open seas? And all these specific challenges that people bring up become apologetics issues that I then look into in defending what the Bible actually says happened. So we know the Bible's true, but we're defending it now by showing that the scientific evidence supports it. And what we're finding is the more I study the subject, the more I am blown away by the huge amount of evidence that supports what the Bible teaches on this, way more than I ever even realized, and that people just don't know about because creationists have been given something of a muzzle that doesn't allow us to present our evidence as vocally as the naturalistic side. And so the numbers show us that naturalists in our country, people that don't believe in anything supernatural, no God and so forth, are up to like 22% of Americans now. And it's no wonder, because we've got 87 to 90% of kids in the America that are in the public school system, and they're not allowed to even hear these things. That's been outlawed. And so naturalism is on the rise, and the whole while we're at an amazing time in creation science where we have this huge amount of evidence that supports what we believe, and most people just don't know about it. And so we're losing youth over this issue. On the low side, 4 out of 10 of youth lose their faith upon leaving home. Some estimates have it more like 6 or 8 out of 10 are losing their faith, in large part because of these kinds of issues. And so that makes creation science so important to show young people, hey, science supports what we believe. There's no reason to reject this as though it's some blind faith, trying to squeeze the round pole of science into the square hole of religion, which is, what some of these guys try to say is, the two are incompatible. That's just not true. That's an ignorant statement when people say that.
Should we not just trust the science? I mean, I've heard that the last 5 years. Is that even sensical?
Interestingly about that idea, just trusting the science, I wrote an article about a year and a half ago that we published, and it is about the reproducibility crisis in science. So what reproducibility is in science is if one, say, laboratory carries out this study and gets it published and has their results and so forth out there where everybody can see these, another lab should be able to take the first lab's research and if they perfectly replicate what the first lab did, they should get the same results. They should be able to reproduce their results. And if that's not able to happen, then it casts some doubt on the first lab's research or the second lab's research or both of their research. And what we're finding in science, there's a reproducibility crisis that has been documented over the last 10 years, where some estimates are over 50% of the published research from the last 10 years is not being able to be reproduced by other laboratories. And so there is a growing distrust in science. And I would argue what's really going on is we've had naturalism shoved down our throats, especially in science, for decades now. And so we have scientists that are more likely to fudge their results in order to be able to get more grant money to get the results they want. They don't have the ethical standard that we used to have in our country when we were more Christian-based in our thinking. But that standard of ethics has been lost because we've been taught for decades now that we are descended from monkeys and ape-like creatures, and therefore ethics there's no standard for that. Like, what's right and wrong? I mean, the evolutionary community would say that's something humans made up. There's no standard that teaches this. And so what would we expect than to have laboratories who are producing studies that can't be reproduced. There's been some fudging going on from someone, and major problem.
Yeah, and if we find out more about how God created our planet, some of these like Darwinian ideas get debunked just because we know about smaller molecules or atoms or the processes different organs go through. And so, is there scientists who are looking for the truth, even if they don't necessarily believe in God or a biblical worldview? Are they starting to see more revelation in God's creation that is making them rethink their previous ideas?
That is a good question. And, one of the most, it's hard for me to talk about this subject and not laugh because um, the leading cosmologists, okay, these are the guys that are studying the universe, studying space, and they're trying to come up with an explanation of how we got here. And these guys are naturalistic, okay, Big Bang believer type guys. And this is them, this is not our term. They have a term called the anthropic principle. And what they mean by this is the more they're digging in and studying the universe, the more they're seeing that the universe seems to have been tailor-made. They'll even use that word, tailor-made, for humans on Earth.
Mm.
And so, like, as in everything, if you and they're more eloquent at showing evidence of design than I would argue many creationists are. I mean, they will wax eloquent about the amazing design features they're seeing, and then they turn around and here's what they say. There's this guy named Bernard Carr, who's a cosmologist at Queen's Mary University out in England, and he said, and he went on about these kinds of design evidence, and he said, look, if you don't want God, you better have a multiverse. Okay, so the evidence is so strongly in favor of there being a God that the only way to get around that conclusion, and all the other cosmologists will quote Bernard Carr, and I've got an article on our website, it's actually in my book, Science versus Evolution, too, where I go through these quotes and show you what the leading cosmologists are saying. They're quoting him and saying, look, if we don't want God, we better have a multiverse. The only way that they feel like they can get around the God idea is basically to go to the comic books. Okay. The multiverse literally, exactly, it literally came out of the comic books. And it's the idea, there's different varieties of the multiverse, but the idea is that there's other universes outside of our own. And if you've got, say, an infinite number of these universes, then at least one of them would happen to be just perfect for us, and we happen to live in that universe. That's the basic argument. And then, hey, that would make it where we don't need a God. But then other naturalistic cosmologists will turn around and say, no, wait a minute, though. Even if that were true, who made the multiverse? So they realize they're not really answering the question, but they're doing everything they can to avoid the powerful evidence that demands that there is a God. And so those are the kind of things that I get to explore and study in digging out their research and so forth, and doing my own research that helps to support it. So pretty exciting field, exciting time for creation science, really.
Hey everyone, I want to interrupt this episode to tell you about the Classical Learning Test. And, I've been a big supporter of them since the very beginning. You've chosen classical conversations and classical education for a reason. But when it comes to assessing your students' progress, finding a like-minded option can be very frustrating. While other standardized tests embrace Common Core curriculum, SEL, ESSA, and feature dry, biased content, the Classical Learning Test assessments for grades 3 to 12 utilize timeless materials and assess foundational skills, providing homeschool parents with a meaningful metric for their students' abilities. The best news is CLT offers 25% off all of their assessments for all CC-connected families. So learn more about CLT's online at-home testing or their paper testing options for your community and get a 25% off discount for that assessment. Follow the link in the show notes, and you can go to info.clt.com classical conversations to get that discount. Go to the show notes with that link. And now we'll go back to the show. So our politicians kick the can down the road, and our scientists try to kick the can back farther. That's what I'm hearing.
That's right. Really far down the road.
One of the fascinating things that I think almost every young man enjoys learning about is dinosaur fossils and thinking about them roaming the earth. There's a whole set of movies about bringing dinosaurs back. So what research or what is the Christian worldview on dinosaurs, and why are they distinct today?
Yeah. Dinosaurs. Yeah, that's an exciting topic. I remember when I was growing up, a lot of Christians would just totally even reject the existence of the dinosaurs. It was so coupled to evolution that they thought, well, they just must have been made up to support evolution. That's just not true. There's an enormous amount of evidence. I've personally been there to see 2 different Triceratops skulls being dug up. These aren't just rocks. These are massive. You can tell they're big heads of these creatures. And I haven't got to let one of my kids get on one of the horns of the Triceratops. I'd let him ride it. He was real small at the time. But anyway, these creatures really existed. And so the question then comes, how does the creationist explain these? From a biblical perspective, God makes all of the creatures on day 6, all the land creatures, not the flying and swimming things, are created on day 5, but at least the creeping creatures. You got your beasts of the earth, humans, they're all created on day 6. That's going to include your dinosaurs. And when we look at the fossil record, they're found in these strata that are labeled the Mesozoic strata. Now, from a creation perspective, those are flood layers. Those are layers that are being laid down when the flood happens. So the dinosaurs are all there in those layers. They're not found outside of those Mesozoic layers as of yet. We haven't found them above that. And they are apparently alive at that time. And because we find, for example, their footprints. Okay, so they're still alive. The flood hits, which tells us these creatures not only lived in the past, but they had to have been on the ark because they're alive when the flood hits. And Noah is supposed to be bringing representatives of all of the different types of beasts of the earth, these land creatures. That would have included the dinosaurs. So a lot of the quibbles, the challenges people have tried to bring up against the biblical flood center around dinosaurs. How do you fit these guys on the ark? And of course, the answer to that is very simple. It is very logical that Noah is bringing juvenile forms of all the creatures on the planet, not only because they're smaller, take up less space, make less waste, require less food, require less care, but they're also, if they're juvenile, they'll live longer after the flood, and therefore can repopulate the planet much easier. But the average size of even adult dinosaur is about the size of an American bison. So these are not all the huge mega sauropods like your brachiosaurs and so forth. And even of the big ones like the titanosaur, I've got a replica of an egg that has been found where the titanosaur, who's the long neck, long tail, one of these massive creatures, starts out in an egg about this big. So picture, about a cantaloupe. Okay, they start out very small. So these guys are apparently on the ark along with all these other creatures, and then get off the ark and begin to populate the area, the earth after that. Now, after the flood, we don't find evidence of fossils of dinosaurs, but we do find evidence that is historical, physical evidences, and even, I would say, biblical evidences. The book of Job in chapter 40, there's a creature that fits very closely to what we would think is a sauropod dinosaur being described there in chapter 40, and it does not fit standard interpretations like a hippopotamus or elephant. I've got lots of material on our website that goes into that, but we have historical evidences of tales that have been passed down with humans interacting with these creatures, physical evidence where archaeological type evidence where humans make drawings or carvings of these types of creatures. So we find evidence of them in those post-flood layers. So the big question then is how does all that, how can that be explained in light of what the evolutionists are arguing? The evolutionists argue these guys went extinct 65 to 66 million years ago. And what we're saying is these guys were on the ark, 4,500 years ago. And so how do we know who's right on that? Well, interestingly, in the last about 15 years or so, there has been a huge amount of evidence coming to light that supports what creationists would predict. And that is in the form of some of these dinosaur fossils. So this lady, Mary Schweitzer, who's not a creationist by any means, several years ago, she cracked open a T-Rex fossil and found soft, stretchy tissue still in this fossil. Like she could stretch it, let it go, and it would pop back to its original form. And so she published this, and in the evolutionary community is like, no way. I mean, these fossils have to be at least 65, 66 million years old, if not more. And there's no way that there's still going to be any soft tissue. And so you did something wrong. You got some contamination or something. So she's like, all right, fair enough. She goes back to the drawing board, does it again, is even more careful, finds the same thing. And so then the other evolutionists start doing the same thing with their fossils. And now there have been dozens of examples of different species, not just in the dinosaurs, but the pterosaurs and the marine reptiles like your ichthyosaurs that have all been found with this soft tissue. And there is no legitimate explanation for how this could exist if they're as old as they claim.
Yeah, how long would soft tissue, like from you, what would you expect it to last? Like if you broke up in a bone from 8,000 years ago, would you think you'd find soft tissue, or is it hundreds of thousands of years until it would disappear?
So all of the actual empirical evidence says there is no known way for soft material like that to last even hundreds of years. In theory, you could get maybe to thousands of years if you have a dry, sterile environment without major extreme temperatures, which is not where we're finding these dinosaur fossils, by the way. And yet what they've got to do is figure out a way to make these millions of years old, and every I say explanation, not even legitimate theory that they've been able to come up with, doesn't hold water. Creationists have come back in our peer review and showed, no, it doesn't work because of this, this, and this, and this. Because we've got our own biomolecular scientists doing the studies and so forth. So there is no explanation from an evolutionary perspective to explain how these could be that old. So what creationists have always said is they're saying these are 65, 66 million years old for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's got to be enough time for these creatures to evolve into something else. They think it's the birds. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is radiometric dating. So several decades ago, radiometric dating came onto the scene, and where you can look at a rock and given certain assumptions, you can determine the age, the actual absolute age of a rock. And what creationists have said is when you dig into those assumptions, you find they're bad assumptions. And we've spent a lot of time documenting those. So we would say the ages are amplified. Because during the flood, we would say there was a period of accelerated decay. It made all rocks appear to be older than they really are. A lot of decay in a small amount of time. But their assumptions include constant nuclear decay. We verified constant nuclear decay. You can't count on that. There are circumstances that make it where you can't say that the rock really is as old as it is. So all of that is to say, even though these dinosaur fossils are found in layers that have been radiometrically dated to be 60 to even 250 million years, some of these fossils we're finding are thought to be that old, over 200 million years. They're found in rock layers that are radiometrically dated to be that old. We would say they're not really that old because the radiometric dating methods are not reliable when you're talking about especially the flood layers where you've got this period of major accelerated decay going on. And the fact that we're finding soft tissue in these dinosaurs is exactly what creationists would predict to find. These dinosaurs are not as old as they're saying. They're on the order of thousands of years old, not tens or hundreds of millions of years. So another fascinating area of creation science.
Growing up, we heard a lot about carbon dating. At least that's kind of is that is this radioactive dating, or is that like is carbon dating still an in thing, or are they kind of still using that or not using that idea?
So carbon dating, so radiometric dating, we're usually looking at inorganic materials like uranium decays into lead over time, and rubidium decays into strontium. Carbon dating is where we're looking at carbon 14 as it decays into nitrogen 14. And so we're looking at things that used to be living, okay, which is not the same as what these other radiometric ages are using. The radiometric dating methods are talking millions of years. Carbon dating is thousands of years, but it also is only considered to be reliable for about 3,000 to 3,500 years for the same reasons as the radiometric dating methods, because we have accelerated decay right when you get up close to the flood. But the carbon dating is ended up being a powerful argument for a young Earth, and here's why. If somebody comes up and says to you, carbon dating proves the Earth's millions of years old, it shows that they're ignorant about the subject, because the half-life of carbon 14 as it decays into nitrogen 14 is thought to be about 5,730 years. And what we mean by that is when a creature dies, it's got this maximum amount of carbon 14 in it. And after 5,730 years, half of the carbon 14 in this, say, bone will turn into nitrogen 14. So if you look at a bone and find from its content that it's half of its carbon 14, half of it is nitrogen 14, then you know it's 5,730 years old, assuming, by the way, that the decay of carbon 14 into nitrogen 14 was constant. After another 5,730 years, half of what's left of the carbon 14 changes into nitrogen 14. So now you have a quarter of the original amount, and we're now up to about 10,000 years. Another 5,730 years, a half of what's left is now turned into nitrogen 14. So now you're down to an eighth, and you keep this process going. We reach a point at about 50,000 years ago where we don't have the technology to detect carbon 14 anymore. So if you find carbon 14 in a bone, for example, you know that it's not even 100,000 years old, much less millions. And yet we're finding carbon 14 in all the layers, even down to the lowest layers that are supposed to be billions of years old. We're finding carbon 14 in fossils that deep, which highlights to us these rock layers are not as old as they've been claimed. If you find carbon 14 in them, unless there's been some kind of contamination, and they're very careful about making sure there's not contamination, if you find carbon 14, you know you're not talking millions of years old. We're talking thousands of years old. And again, even then, we would say there's accelerated decay that telescopes those ages even more beyond, if you're talking about things that are older than about 1500 BC or so.
Yeah, so accelerated decay, basically there is some sort of event that accelerated these processes.
Yes. So so in other words, that makes it where instead of 5,730 years for carbon 14, for half of the carbon 14 to turn into nitrogen 14, something accelerates that, where maybe instead of 5,730 years, the same amount of decay happens in 1,000 years, something like that. And so then and we've been able to document in creation science that there was a period of accelerated decay. And so now we're trying to figure out, well, what are the circumstances that can cause that? And so there's been some interesting research in that, and that helps us learn more about the conditions of the flood.
What are some scientific breakthroughs that you guys are working on right now? Like that you would say would be super helpful, or things that you're hoping to come out over the next year or 5 years or 10 years?
Well, me and the writers that do work with us at Apologetics Press, I'll narrow it to that because creation science in general is way bigger. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, but some of the things we're doing, one of our auxiliary writers is actually kind of on the ground floor of studying extracting DNA from dinosaur fossils. So this is exciting, and we're hoping that creationists will be among the very first to be able to do this. And so he's one of our biochemists that's a professor. And then we have another guy that's a nuclear engineer that we're in kind of the opening stages of doing some study with nuclear reactors where we are trying to figure out what are some of the factors that can affect the rate of decay of some of these, like uranium to lead, for example, and looking at, for example, how the sun is possibly able to affect that. Some of the work that I'm doing is I mentioned to you the cave idea, and again, creationists have always had a theory as to how we explain caves, but we haven't had anybody go in and show how the evidence supports that these caves were being formed by dissolving rock from rising hot acidic waters in the flood. And so I've gone into like about 80 caves now to see if they have these features that would be predicted if these caves formed from rising acidic waters in the flood. And I've been able to find those features in every one of them. That I feel like creationists can say now with confidence that these caves were formed from that big word hypo-gene speleogenesis, which what that means is the forming of caves from below. Hypo-gene speleogenesis is really what we're talking about. Instead of descending water, it's ascending water coming up from below. We would say due to tectonic activity going on during the flood that creates there's a lot of magma that's exposed that mixes with water and oxygen. That'll form sulfuric acid. It's going to be extremely hot, so it's going to be pushing upwards because heat rises. And as it goes, it's going to be dissolving rock along the way, and that's ultimately how we explain the cave. So that's exciting. I intend to expand my research further west and study the other caves that way. Maybe jump across the pond and do some work elsewhere too. We're also interested in doing some study of folded strata. This is so exciting, this work. I don't know how much you want me to get into this, but it's exciting stuff. But it's Cliff Notes version, essentially, if we find folded sedimentary strata where you've got rock beds that turn at major angles, but then they're bent, not broken, then that's powerful evidence that of the flood, that these layers were deposited rapidly and moved before they even had time to totally turn to stone, lithify. And creationists have found some powerful evidence of that at Grand Canyon, and we'd like to expand that work elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I've seen one of the creation movies was talking a little bit about that. I don't remember if it was an AIG movie or
yes. It's called Mountains After the Flood, and it's the work of Andrew Snelling, who's the PhD geologist that has worked for them for years. And he was going to investigate this very thing. And so you've got these strata at Grand Canyon and in several places, but there's a couple down in the Tapete Sandstone, which is the layers of rock down at the bottom of the fossil record that we would say is the beginning of the flood. And you have huge amounts of this strata that are going along horizontally, and then all of a sudden they turn and they'll go like 90 degrees up in the air. And creationists have said, well, I mean, if you try to take a rock and bend it, it's not going to bend, it's going to break. So how do you have strata totally bent? Well, this suggests that these strata had been deposited very rapidly. They're still soft. The secular view is these strata take thousands of years to gradually be deposited over time. We would say it was all deposited rapidly, and while it's still soft, it's bent by fast tectonic movement. Well, what secular guys have said, well, you could bend rocks like that if you do it very slowly and it metamorphoses those rocks. Or instead of sedimentary, you turn them into metamorphic rocks. And then it could explain how these rocks could be bent without breaking. Well, what Andrew Snelling was going to do is go in and show, which amazingly nobody had done, even in the secular community. He was going to go in and show at those bends, there's still sedimentary rock. There's no evidence of metamorphose type work, type action going on, which is what the movie Mountains After the Flood is investigating. So he tried to get a permit from the National Park Service, I guess, to go in and do that. They rejected him because he's a creationist. Answers in Genesis went to court over it, won. And so he got to go in and do that work and substantiate what creationists have always said, and that is these are sedimentary rocks. These were deposited rapidly and bent from fast activity, exactly as we would predict if the flood happened as described in the Bible. So it's really cool, exciting work, maybe the most exciting, at least in my opinion, of the last several decades.
Well, I just want to go back to the first thing you said that you guys were working on, which was extracting DNA, and then something with nuclear engineering. And I just want you to know that Godzilla is not something that we should be working on.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's no talk about trying to make the dinosaurs come back, like Jurassic Park or something. But somebody is going to try to do that if we get enough DNA. Because they're already trying to do it with mammoths, the woolly mammoths, because we can extract that DNA easier, and we can use elephants for that. But dinosaurs, that's a little bit different question.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show today, diving down deep into some of these details that, we might not get exposure to unless we're intentionally looking for it. And there is a lot of great creation science information out there that's verifying or showing that it's not they're not counter. The flood and science aren't counter to one another, that our biblical beliefs are rooted in a strong scientific evidence. And the more that we know about the world that God's created, the more it sounds like people are having to, at least internally recognize that, even if they're not willing to put it on paper. So how can your average homeschooling family or Christian group learn more about the work you all are doing, and what are some resources that they should use to get started with?
Yeah, our website is apologeticspress.org. As long as you can spell apologetics, you're gold. And you can see tons of materials there. The thing that I'm most excited about, especially in this creation science realm, is the book that I wrote on the flood. That's written at a high school level, called Flooded. And it's designed to bring young people up to speed on the latest thinking in creation science. It's based especially on the peer review that we do in creation science. People try to claim that creationists don't have a peer review process, and they're just ignorant. They don't understand we do have that. We have got peer review journals and so forth. And so Flooded gives kind of a breakdown of where we're at in creation science. And a few years ago, somebody approached us, one of our supporters of Apologetics Press, and said, hey, it would be really cool if you taught this Flooded book, use it as a textbook and teach flood science, like the foundations of science from a biblical perspective, out in Arizona, where kids can go out there and not just see this stuff in a book, but actually go to the Grand Canyon and see evidence of the flood there, and Meteor Crater and Petrified Forest and some of these cool places, and actually do this for credit as like a short course kind of a thing. And I thought, that's a pretty cool idea. And so we've done that now for the last 3 years, and it is a life-changing experience for these kids. They get to not only learn what science is really always supposed to be about, and that is learning about God and the things he's done, but they get to be there, be immersed in the evidence, and learn how to defend their faith in preparation for college. And so I actually have a session of this Flooded course that I do out there that I'm dedicating just to classical conversation students. It's my classical conversation session, and have even try to even have staff that are all CC people like my wife, for example. And again, with CC kids in mind, so it's something I'm very excited about. And kids can, if they're interested in that, they can contact us to get more information at CRP, that's for Creation Research Program, CRP at apologeticspress.org. And we can get them information about how they can get involved in that really cool course.
That's CRP at apologeticspress.org. And what age group is that for? Is there is it targeted
is basically challenge students. So it's age 14 really through about age 18 is what we're targeting. So it's kind of the challenge level kids there.
Awesome. Well, my kids are too young for that, but you got to keep it going at least a few more years so that we can go join you out there in Arizona and see it, because it sounds like an amazing trip. So thank you again for being on the show today. Thank you, listeners. If this was fascinating to you, if you didn't know that there was so much science that backed the Bible, if you didn't know that nearly 50% of scientific journals are now having to retract studies because they're just false, that the data has been messed with, this is a good episode to share with a friend, help reveal this information, because the truth will set us free. And God's planet is going to be reflected in his science and in his design. And it's no surprise that despite the lack of government funding, and actually probably a lot of time government trying to get in your way, just like they tried to do in Arizona, that creationists are coming out on top. So until next time, study your Bible, study God's world, and share this episode with a friend. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortons. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.